Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the closing plenary of the Conference on Globalization at the Crossroads, Rethinking Inequalities and Boundaries. A key way to rethink inequalities is to look at how biodiversity and our ecosystems sustains our lives and makes it a pleasure. Since 1987, we have known that social, ecological, and economic issues are interrelated, integrated, and interconnected. And therefore, is absolutely essential that our community of scholars within EADI work more and more with ecological issues. And I'm absolutely delighted that today we will focus on sustainability and the green shift in an era of disruptions. This session stands between you and lunch, but as we all know, there is no such thing as a free lunch. In anticipating the future, we expect 4 types of interconnected disruptions. Socio-economic disruptions, which began with the financial crisis of the last decade, and which may spill into much more complex disruptions as a consequence of the increasing deregulation of the financial sector. We began this week by discussing how financial power and exchange rate fluctuations may exacerbate inequality and how states are unwilling or unable to tax the super rich and large multinationals and thereby have less resources to finance public goods. Political disruptions may result when people frustrated by the actual or perceived impacts of globalization support populist politicians to undermine the very principles on the basis of which our institutions have been built. And previous plenary speakers have shown how migrants and refugees have been dehumanized in the way they have been discussed and how they are scarcely taken into account in national development strategies. We also discussed whether it is our very choice of words that has framed the way we look at the world and has played a significant role in differentiating between the us and the them, and whether that very us and them has sustained the differences. Technological disruptions and creative destruction are inherent to modern life. But are these disruptions proceeding at a pace faster than we can address through existing institutions? While technologies solve existing challenges, they also replace the need for labor as we move into a world of robots and artificial intelligence. Who has the monopoly over technology and technological innovation, and how will this exacerbate inequalities? For example, will our seeds increasingly become privatized in a more technological world? As Einstein once said, as the circle of light increases, so does the circumference of darkness around it. And all these potential disruptions are taking place in the context of ecological disruptions. We are in the middle of the 6th largest extinction event in the history of the Earth. We are in the process of trying to stop irreversible climate change. Today, it is only fitting that we look at what brings us together as humans, the fact that we share one Earth, that we are so dependent on the air we breathe, the weather that brings us sunshine and rain, and the land and water bodies that sustain all other life forms, help us to provide us the food we need, and the inspiration for our scientific community and for development. At the same time, we face limits. We face absolute limits in terms of how much land there is and water. And even though we have enough fossil fuels, we need to leave about 80% underground if we are to achieve a stable climate. And while rich and poor countries have argued about who has the right to use these fossil fuels and for how long, time is running out. And the issue now for developing countries is whether it is very risky for them to continue to build a fossil fuel-based economy when we know that despite the position of the current US president, fossil fuel technologies are destined to become obsolete. The good news is if we live within our ecosystem limits, we can ensure continued support from these ecosystem services to the way we live and to other life forms on Earth. But when we have limits, there are three governance options. The first is, some people would argue, to privatize these resources and use markets for distribution. The second is hegemonic control and monopolization of the resources. The third is to try and share them through the Sustainable Development Goals. I am delighted and honored to be able to introduce our two distinguished speakers today. One will focus on the global and the United Nations. The other will focus on the local and urban networks. Both will focus on how development needs to be redefined in the context of ecological challenges and the anticipated disruptions facing our Earth. You may either participate by sending in your questions to slido.com or by raising your hands at the end of the session. Our first speaker is Achim Steiner. He studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford and London, has worked all over the world, has led the United Nations Environment Programme, was professor at Oxford Martin School, and is currently leading the United Nations Development Programme. Achim Steiner previously held other notable positions, including being Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Secretary General of the World Commission on Dams. He thus combines a scholarly basis with a commitment to change global institutions in order to promote a more sustainable world. Professor Steiner is probably the global expert on how ecological challenges can be used to redefine development in an era of expected and unexpected disruptions in the context of an unequal world. Please welcome him with me.
Thank you so much, Joyeeta. I think this is what one calls a setup, really, isn't it? Because after this introduction, I think I face an enormous challenge, which is to live up to what indeed has been an extraordinary life journey of opportunities to work on issues that are very much part of the development discourse, that are at the center also of this conference, and that certainly have become central to my professional focus. And when I originally responded to the invitation by saying I would love to come to this conference, particularly to reconnect also with a number of you who work at the front line of development research, I was in the comfortable position of being the director of the Oxford Martin School, so I was one of you. Now I arrive here and I still decided to come because, as one of you put it to me, I'm now more likely to be the object of study, if not critique, and to some extent represent in the discussions that part of our development process and institutional setup that is both often credited with setting narratives, but also often associated with not living up to the aspirations that it defines. So to you, Professor Gupta, thank you first of all for the kind introduction. Let me also recognize Professor Susan Parnell, who will also speak to you this morning, and then we, I think, jointly together will hopefully not have presented diametrically opposed views of the future, and certainly my main reason also for having come to Bergen this morning is to reach out to many of you who I believe have a critical role to play in informing how a development discourse can evolve, can progress, and particularly to do so in the aftermath of an Agenda 2030 on sustainable development, a set of sustainable development goals having been arrived at by a surprisingly coherent and an ultimately successful process that was not led by the learned community, nor led by UN experts, but actually led by member states who in turn were the subject of very significant influencing by academic, scientific, civil society, business groups, who actually over a 2-year period played a significant role in leading to this adoption of Agenda 2030 in the General Assembly just 2 years ago. In coming to you and taking the title of Globalization at the Crossroads, Rethinking Inequalities and Boundaries as the departure point, let me begin by saying that as we sit here today in Bergen and look across the globe, there is a degree of frustration, a degree of concern that I think we all hold about what happens next in this global community of nations and peoples and very divergent realities set against the backdrop of escalating social risks, but also environmental risks, sustainability risks, and a world that is struggling to figure out how on earth it will feed 7, 8, 9, 10 billion people, how it will provide electricity and energy, how it will assure mobility and food security in a world that already has learned bitter lessons that where it fails to do so, social cohesion, economic progress, and actually whole nations can fall apart over those failures. We live in not just dramatic times, where the manifestation of failure can also easily lead to violence, to extremism, to bigotry, to xenophobia, to racism, to a dark view of our common future. And, you know, this is the country that gave the world a woman and a leader whose name became associated with the most optimistic outlook on the future, Gro Harlem Brundtland. I don't know how many of you still have that report on your shelves. It was one of those epochal reports that changed the conversation about development. And yet here we are in the year 2017, and many of us would lament the lack of progress. But I actually want to step in front of you this morning and say to you, let's take a step back for a moment and look at what happened in 2015 when this Agenda 2030 was adopted by the General Assembly, when the world took upon itself to work under a common framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. Many within governments, within civil society, even within the UN system, I'm sure amongst the community of your institutions of research and policy think tanks, probably greeted this new agenda with a degree of healthy skepticism. I want to convince you to, if you are still convinced that this is something that is peripheral to what happens next, to rethink, and to rethink fast. First of all, from a purely conceptual point of view, Agenda 2030 is an extraordinarily important milestone. It is the first time in 70 years that not only in terms of the international system associated with the United Nations, but actually as a global community of nations that we have one development agenda. We have stopped pretending that development is defined only by what the poor do in the South and somehow will be enabled by resources, technology, wisdom and knowledge of the North to choose wiser development path. It's a very crude way of describing the early era of development discourse, but you know, it's not so far from the truth. The fact of the matter is that the development agenda adopted in New York in 2015 is universal, and it's not just a word. It's actually a vital watershed moment in recognizing a number of fundamental realities. First of all, the reality that what happens in one part of the world will fundamentally influence what happens in another part of the world. And it was initially largely driven through an environmental change perspective and lens, particularly with climate change obviously being the most dramatic illustration of how a South Pacific Islanders' future was essentially determined by the decision of a nation, let's just take America as an example, or indeed many others, in terms of their fossil fuel consumption and their emissions footprint in the future. And that South Pacific Island nation or national would have virtually no voice, no choice, no control, and no influence over an existential decision by others over his or her own future. It's a very simple and simplistic way of demonstrating why the climate change conversation went global and why ultimately that climate change debate also drove the emergence of a universal agenda. But here also we began to recognize that it's not just an environmental and planetary boundary driven set of drivers that led us to this different discourse. It was also not least in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the meltdown that we all lived through, that we began to look at a singular economically driven paradigm of development that essentially argued, whether through the narrative of the Washington Consensus or otherwise, in neoclassical economic terms, neoliberal terms, that if only you could achieve economic momentum through liberalization, through trade, and ultimately through investment flows, development would follow. And I think what the 2008 financial crisis did was it was to put a spotlight on an extraordinary set of false assumptions, and also to put a spotlight on many hidden developments that were coming back to haunt us as communities, as societies, and ultimately as a global economy that had been invoked for so long as the driver of development success. Indeed, inequality, just in the last few years, has begun to be understood for what it is, the most corrosive force in terms of social cohesion, the most dangerous driver of differentiation in a society that, when combined with ethnic, religious, geographical, or other identifiers, can become the organizing principle for essentially social discord, conflict, and nations literally falling apart. And initially we thought this would happen in nations that are fragile and volatile. We looked to the Arab Spring, we looked to meltdowns in some of the major emerging economies. But then on top of the financial crisis came the so-called migration crisis, a crisis that really was only a crisis in the view of Europe rather than the rest of the world, since many other countries around the world had been dealing with millions of refugees for quite a number of years, thank you very much, and with much less global attention. And yet the essence of Europe began to be questioned, and the whole process of a unified European capacity to be more resilient in the face of global challenges began to be questioned on the back of a few million refugees. And I don't use that term in any way derogatively. I simply want to put it in perspective with the total number of people who currently are actually displaced. Last year, over 65 million people worldwide were actually not able to stay in the place that they call home, either internally displaced or forced to flee their countries because of conflict, because of drivers that we can now spend a lot of time discussing, whether they're economic drivers, poverty drivers, or simply a lack of perspective that there is a life to be had under the circumstances that I'm bringing my children up in a place called home. The fact of the matter is that the corrosive force of an economic model that we now clearly have far greater understanding of, empirical evidence and even analyses such as that of our esteemed colleague Piketty, who I just want to again quote perhaps one of the most memorable phrases that emerged out of his work on capitalism, that its inherent tendency to generate an explosive spiral of increasing inequality of wealth and income is, in a sense, sowing the seeds of self-destruction if not addressed, if not understood. The fact that we now have also far greater empirical evidence of how the wealth accumulated on the back of a seemingly successful story of GDP growth lasting over decades actually reveals an extraordinary amount of inequality, concentration of wealth at one end, but also stagnation in wages and levels of income. And that behind that is a hidden tendency for labor and therefore human capital to be the loser in this game, while technology and capital in its financial sense is the big winner, and therefore has driven this polarization in our societies in different ways and under different circumstances in more industrialized, developed economies, but actually revealing itself with similar phenomena if other drivers and reasons also in many of the more rapidly developing economies should be a warning sign to us all. And I would argue that the reason why in the year 2015 nations found themselves, I think, almost more by accident, certainly not by long-term design, in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly, adopting a very different development paradigm, is precisely because of the realization that economics and financially deterministic model of development, that whether it was critiqued or not, was dominating public policy, regulatory policy, financial markets policy, central bank policy, and quite frankly also development institutions policy, whether from the international financial institutions to the big bilateral actors in our international system. And clearly cascaded down into virtually every developing economy as the framework that was set or adopted or embraced as the way forward. Agenda 2030, therefore, in its universality, was a mutual recognition that the risks of continuing along a development pathway as we had done for the last 20 years not only was doomed to fail those nations that it was meant to benefit, it also created an exponentially growing risk to the very wealthy in the world, who began to realize that both the environmental risks and the social risks, including of conflict and civil strife, that would spread across regions, was actually something that was threatening the very notion of development as a common enterprise. So the Sustainable Development Goals, critiquable by each one of us, and let's be frank, each one of us probably thinks we could have written them in a much cleverer way, much more eloquent, and perhaps we could have summarized the world's great challenges in just 5 goals. I think these are all red herring discussions, if I may be frank with you, because I think it is extraordinary. And I think we should for a moment step back and acknowledge that 193 nations, through a public debate and transparent process in the full glaring light of observers from all parts of our society, were able to arrive at, in 2 years, a set of 17 goals that, however imperfect they may be in so many respects, actually capture what should unify us in looking at the future of development as not something that is premised on competition and outcompeting your neighbor, but actually roots development in a notion of collective success and is based on the principle that success can only be achieved if countries learn to work together. And that globalization, therefore, is not defined by, the ever faster cycle and flow of goods and commodities and finance, but that globalization will ultimately be defined by the capacity of a global community of 7 billion, soon 8, 9, 10 billion people, being able to act collectively in solidarity with one another, notwithstanding all the differences, whether in values, in economic realities, in development conditions and opportunities, in whether you have oil and gas offshore or not, thinking now that we are here in Norway and in Bergen. This, I would say to you, is something that needs to be taken extremely seriously, because it is actually an extraordinary moment in terms of development discourse not being defined by a few experts, by a school of thought, or by a particular ideology, but by the fledgling attempts of creating and forging consensus in a very conflicted world in which polarization, inequality between nations, never mind in terms of inequality within nations, and the challenge and the threat of environmental risks either lead us to succeed with this agenda, even if it is just a stepping stone, or to face extraordinary risks to our common future, to invoke for a moment again Gro Harlem Brundtland. Now, there are 1,001 ways in which one could discuss this, and I will not take your time up by reciting to you the individual goals. What I would say to you is, and now in my capacity as administrator of UNDP, and this title is something I'm still trying to get used to. I've been many things, but I've never been an administrator in my life, so forgive me if from the towers of academic wisdom I now sound like I'm in the basement of a development accounting machine. But You know, I head an organization now that is an extraordinary promise to the world. It began really as a vision of another kind of Marshall Plan, a fund that was established at the time, built on this philosophy that, you know, a part of the world had succeeded in development and it was now incumbent upon it to help others to succeed. We have come a long way since then. The United Nations Development Programme today is the backbone of a United Nations development system. It works on the ground in 170 countries. It's an extraordinary resource that I want to bring closer to you today because I need you to take an interest also in this resource as more than just an institution of the United Nations system. We are a platform for trading ideas, for taking best practices from one corner of the world to another, for taking the aspirational goals of, you know, Agenda 2030, or indeed a human rights upfront approach, or gender equality, or the rights of indigenous peoples, into the reality of everyday governance and decision-making across 170 nations on this planet. It's an extraordinary privilege to have the opportunity to lead this institution because I think at this particular moment in time, this is the moment for which UNDP actually was established in the United Nations system. And I take it from a very personal point of view because I am by training really a development economist. That's where I started my journey over 30 years ago. I chose, and this is also why Jürgen and you as organizers invited me here, to then move increasingly into the environment, sustainability, environmental change domain because I felt that it was the Achilles heel of the development discourse and that many who led that development discourse were simply illiterate on understanding the science of environmental change and, more importantly, the development implications of ignoring these environmental change phenomena. I consider 2015 and the Agenda 2030 also an extraordinary culmination in finally realizing what the 1992 Rio Earth Summit set out and that Brundtland and her co-commissioners defined in terms of a paradigm shift that was needed. But it took us another 20 years from the original Rio Earth Summit to actually arrive at a set of goals that recognize the second major defining characteristic, which is integration. Imperfect as it may have done it, there is no goal in the 17 goals that is not premised on progress being achieved outside the original domain that would have been associated with that goal. So if it is an economics or economically focused goal, it carries within it the DNA also of targets and indicators that clearly demand an explicit acknowledgement that social and environmental steps are fundamental to achieving that economic outcome, and vice versa. So alongside universality comes integration, and when I was offered a few months ago, and I've only been in my new position for 8 weeks, the opportunity to lead the United Nations Development Programme at this particular moment in time, I did not hesitate for long, because this is the moment where development either is rethought and the development paradigm reinvented and evolved on the basis of an imperfect but nevertheless visionary articulation that the Sustainable Development Goals provide us with, or we will indeed talk about the failure of development as perhaps the most distinguishing feature of the early part of the 21st century. Without going into too much detail, I want to spend a few minutes on trying to illustrate why this agenda is not just important in its own right, but also points us in the direction of a number of failures. Some call it market failures, policy failures, development failures, misalignments. I think we can give it many different names, but to use a very simple one, I just call them discontinuities. Discontinuities in logical thought, in common sense thought, because what has led us very often to the points of crisis that we have right now is a lack of capacity to think in systemic terms, to apply common sense to what we are seeing, rather than being defined by or entrapped in certain schools of thought that almost predetermined a desirable set of outcomes that we were striving for. Let me look for a moment at one of the areas that also in the year 2015, interesting enough, gave rise to the Addis Ababa summit, which focused on the whole question of finance. In the world that we describe today in terms of challenges and threats and the need to respond, there is one inherent concept that we have to acknowledge. We are talking about fundamental disruptions, systemic transitions and transformations on scales and timelines that are without precedent in modern human history. Just the notion of decarbonizing our global economy over the next 30 to 50 years boggles the mind. In fact, it has paralyzed the mind of many of those who currently are the captains of our global economy. It is something that is almost unenvisageable because it is, in terms of magnitude and radical shifts, I believe without precedent. Yet, the interesting thing is, the last 25 years we have spent, first of all, establishing a comprehension of the significance and the cost of inaction, if I may invoke Lord Nicholas Stern's term for a moment. Science for the better part of the last 20 years remained the arena of contest. Is climate change real? And, even 5 years ago, we were still debating, do you believe in climate change? I have often struggled with the very question because climate change is all and many things, but certainly not an act of belief and faith. To equate a set of scientifically and empirically observed phenomena, associate them with profound risks to the future of humanity, and equate them to a debate that we would have in a religious meeting or in another societal setting where my belief and your belief have equal rights is an absurdity. And yet we spent the better part of 2 decades trying to address this issue because we also had only imperfect scientific knowledge. For anyone to argue today that we lack the basis on which to act on climate change is actually to lead not only our generation but future generations into territories that one day will find themselves in some form of international criminal court. I have no doubt about that, because the degree of irresponsibility and lack of assuming responsibility to enable transitions to happen are today still judged as part of the political arena of democracy. Within a generation, the inaction on these issues will not only boggle the minds of our children, who will ask themselves, how on earth in the year 2017 could you still be debating whether you should take the risk of climate change and its consequences seriously, never mind what you have done to us. Because in 50 years' time, my son, who will then be 55 or 60 years old, will have lost probably a larger part of even the set of choices that could have been made. So this is the nature of the dramatic challenge, and when we talk then about decarbonization, we are looking at energy systems, at buildings, at infrastructure, at mobility, at agriculture, and so on, that have to embrace technological change, that have to also reinvent themselves right down to basic economic and business models. Yet it became very clear to me, and you referred to my time in UNEP a few years ago, that if the necessity to act was ultimately no longer going to be contested, and the possibility to act, as Nicholas Stern and many others have since then demonstrated, actually existed, then the single most defining factor would be whether we could afford to act, because we are an economically and financially determined civilization at the moment, and the argument that you can't afford to act almost legitimizes decisions that are indefensible if you take the responsibility for the next generation seriously. So how on earth would we achieve success in these transformations if we could not find a way in which we could realign the way the financial markets, essentially 70 to 80% of everything that happens in our economies and is transacted through finance, could be aligned with these kinds of transformational objectives? Because, to be very frank, until probably about 3 to 4 years ago, the vast majority of our financial system was focused on the 20th century economy. While sustainable development, climate change, inequality, all these national and international risks to our common security were pointing into a totally different direction. If alignment between the financial markets and that kind of agenda could not be achieved, then success would simply be impossible. We would be doomed. That's why in the context of debates around finance, sustainable finance, UNEP at the time also began this inquiry into green finance and looking at how financial markets, regulatory authorities, central banks, the signals and incentives that we would be able to articulate towards the financial system could be informed by the necessity to act. And remarkably, what emerged is, first of all, a global economy in which hundreds of trillions of dollars, which are our financial system today, in terms of household wealth, in terms of institutional investors, whether it's pension funds, hedge funds, insurance funds, that entire financial capital is actually tuned towards an economy that is not in tune with the kind of transformations we're talking about. And the extreme of this is actually observable in some of the largest reinsurance companies in the world. Insurance and reinsurance companies have been at the forefront of trying to raise awareness about climate change, the risk to infrastructure being the obvious argument, the insurability. Yet, in these very same institutions, there are two universes, those who insure risk and the others who manage the capital that the insurance companies actually have as the backbone of their capacity to be operators in the insurance market. If you then start looking at how that capital is invested, it was Swiss Re and Munich Re that themselves began to realize to some degree the illogical consequence of investing in an economy that they were describing in risk profile terms as actually almost uninsurable in the future. But this is just a small illustration. So here is one of the major discontinuities, that we need extraordinary amount of effort right now, particularly from the research community, to try and understand how do we shift the 70 to 80% of financial capital in our economies in terms of alignment with change, transformation, and transition. A second area in which we are looking in UNDP also now with ever greater focus, together with also our sister agency, the International Labour Organization, is this question of the future of work. You may be aware that the ILO has just launched a new commission ready to report on its centenary in 2019 on the future of work. And it became to me also very obvious during my time at the Oxford Martin School, where the future of work is one of its major research themes, that living in an age where technology is changing so fast, the digital economy, automation, artificial intelligence, we are again being trapped in a deterministic narrative about technologies that could prove fatal to social cohesion. People want to work, and yet the future of work at the moment is a very bleak one. Technology and the debate about will artificial intelligence and automation necessarily eliminate jobs is beyond the point of, well, we don't know. We know that we will eliminate millions of jobs. In fact, Carl Frey and colleagues at the Oxford Martin School have been at the forefront of estimating what could be the potential range within which we look at loss of jobs. The question we are less able to answer is, will that new economy of tomorrow also create so many more new jobs, and therefore it's a kind of net zero loss scenario? I think if you look at both the dramatic speed with which not only automation but also artificial intelligence, and therefore an almost unprecedented shift in technological capacity to produce is now driving our economies, and you ask yourself, how would a continent like Africa, where there are now 1 billion citizens today, but another billion there in the next 20 to 30 years, and therefore hundreds of millions of people for whom we have to find jobs in a market where people are entering the job market in their tens of millions, how would that continent succeed in a global economy that may well relocate production to the continent of Africa? But it will be with the latest technology. It will be the factories that use robots to produce cars and not people. So yes, there will be GDP growth, and there will be even integration into the global economy, and there will be trade, but it will be a zero job growth. Now, do we really believe that this is a prospect that one simply has to surrender oneself to? And I just want to quote you one brief example that Bill Gates put forward just a few weeks ago, which is essentially the question that why is it that we would not tax a robot in the same way that we would tax a person working on the production line of a factory. Because if the robot replaces a human being, why is it that we discriminate in our fiscal and taxation system between one of the things we consider a great benefit, work, employment, and punish it with very heavy taxation, namely income tax, and in the form of capital and a machine, we apply a different rationale for tax. This is the underlying challenge that I described earlier on, where our economies are increasingly concentrating wealth in those who hold capital and own capital, and people, the vast majority of our citizens who want to provide for their families, are looking for employment and jobs, are actually caught in an economy where they're increasingly marginalized and alienated. These discontinuities go right through issues such as food and food security. We will have 10 billion people soon. We are talking about 70% more food being produced, yet you are all familiar with some of the vital statistics of our agricultural economy today. 70% of our water is already being used or wastefully used for agricultural production. Anywhere between a quarter to a third of our arable land has been either degraded or literally put out of production. We have a net loss of arable land for food production now defining our annual economic progress. Yes, we can intensify, but is the kind of agricultural economy that on the one hand says we need to produce more food, but that also rationalizes an ever greater concentration of agricultural production in the hands of a few massive land-owning enterprises, and at the end of the day also seems to rationalize perhaps one of the most absurd phenomena of our time, namely that over 1/3 of all the food that we produce every year is actually never consumed by human beings. It's lost between farm and market, and quite frankly, in the industrialized and wealthier nations, simply thrown away. 1/3 or more. These are the latest estimates by FAO. So on the one hand, we talk about the challenge of emissions of agriculture, we talk about the loss of arable land, the ecological infrastructure, water scarcity, and yet our economic framework for food security and agricultural production seems to be encouraging a totally irrational evolution of the system. I wanted to present just a few of these examples from the misalignment of finance with actually the transformation agenda, the challenge of technology-led development that in one sense is an extraordinary promise, and let me be very clear, artificial intelligence, automation, the digital economy also bring us extraordinary opportunities. But we have choices to make, and the future of work is inextricably linked to the way we deploy technology and the choices we make as societies. And a simple thing, the most basic thing that every human being needs, food every day on their plate. The way that we are keeping ourselves alive in an agricultural economy that now dominates the world's markets is dominated in terms of inputs, seeds, and technology by just a dozen companies. Is simply leading us astray. That is the driver, that is the set of continuities that have in part informed also the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it is these issues, amongst others, and I only wanted to pick a few to highlight the importance for us to find a common interest across the research and policy think tank community, the institutions that are at the same time working with countries, with communities, with the private sector on the front lines of interpreting these global challenges into opportunities for action. Action that allows us not to define success by literally outdoing the other, whether it is my neighbor, the neighboring country, the poor global south, or the rich global north. These polarities are not helping us in this day and age. And this is why I want to convince you that, first of all, the United Nations is not an anachronism. In fact, we need this notion of nations united to act and to succeed more than ever before, notwithstanding the contradictions and the challenges that are staring us in the face every day. Secondly, as the United Nations Development Programme, as the partnership, if you want, around development of nations coming together, I genuinely call on you to engage with us, to by all means critique the work and the status quo, but above all to bring the intelligence, the creativity, the ingenuity, and your knowledge of what is happening on the ground to bear on the kind of policy narratives, but also instruments and tools that we are called upon every day to share with countries across the world. We need more thought leadership. We have an era in which cynicism, skepticism, frustration, disappointment, and failure in many ways defines the development narrative. It is a self-indulgent luxury. It's false, because behind many of the failures are actually extraordinary success stories also. And I won't cite the numbers to you, you're hopefully familiar with them. And thirdly, it's an abdication of responsibility. We live in an age where time is our greatest enemy. The luxury of sitting and staring at one another and describing one another's irrelevance to the task at hand is the luxury that I think future generations would simply not be able to relate to. That's my reason to be here with you in Bergen today. In all humility, and as a former colleague, saying to you also, the boundaries between the institutions we work in, the epistemic communities we serve, and that define us also in our work, should never blind us to the potential for joining force. Respecting one another's different departure points, identities, and views, but above all, helping the world to take something like Agenda 2030 and the SDGs from an aspirational statement of necessity and desirability to actually a vehicle for success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Steiner, for that absolutely inspiring and brilliant speech, asking us all to collaborate and cooperate, not only amongst us as individuals, but amongst states, for asking us as scholars to join and collaborate with UNDP and to perhaps work with you more in the future, and for giving us a picture about the need to work on the SDGs and to help participate in this transformative agenda at the global level. And this brings me to my introduction to our next brilliant speaker, Professor Susan Parnell. She is presently Professor of Environmental and Geographical Sciences at the University of Cape Town, has had previous academic positions at Wits University and the University of London, apart from having visiting fellowships at London School of Economics, Oxford, Durham University, amongst others. She's published extensively, not only on urban historical geography, the rise of racial residential segregation, but also many, many contemporary issues, including green economy and urban challenges today, as well as urban environmental justice. In doing so, she is not just a scholar, but she actively collaborates with local municipalities and other actors, so she's also in some ways an activist. So from the global to the local, your word.
Well, I hope, in fact, that we can stay somewhere between the global and the local. And thank you, Achim, for your presentation. And I hope that I'm going to be speaking with you and in that spirit of an epistemic community, and to pick up on that challenge for us in the room, either as practitioners to be open to the idea of rethinking what we do, or as scholars to the idea that we need to engage more actively in a constructive agenda. In a formative agenda, to deal with some of the complex issues that are before us. And effectively what I want to do is to take off from where you've left off, to take absolutely everything that has been said about this momentous position of policy shift, of realignment, of paradigmatic reflection and recalibration to think about what we need to do. And I want to bring that down to make one core argument, that in order to realize green growth and progress that's implied in the 2030 agenda, what we have to do is to transform cities. Now, if you're a rural development person, please listen with me the whole way. Try and park the hackles, because I think you'll see where I'm getting to on this. And I wanted to begin, in fact, with a quote from Arama Revi in this week's Cityscope, which is really about the question of why cities. And it's everything that we know, that the economy is focused in cities, that the population is focused in cities, but that the fiscal kinds of questions and investments that you were talking about are not spatially neutral. They will be concentrated in the urban context. And so, although we do not agree on what a city is, on what the scale of a city region may be, we nonetheless have a confluence, if not a consensus, about the fact that cities have a primacy in development moving forward. And that's for any number of reasons. And I think it's useful to understand that different people endorse that for different reasons. For some, it is simply that we live in a demographic age, a majority urban condition. It will become more urban. For other people, it's this point about concentration, that investment will take place in cities. For other people, if you come out of an engineering tradition, because this is where we get material lock-in. This is where we actually have to face the consequences of our carbon imprint. Politically, we have a massive challenge to the Westphalian system, where we know, particularly in the context of debates about devolution, and I will come back to that the way that we have run things for the last 80, so 100 years more, are now in crisis. Cities are the places where modernity and tradition conflict, come to the fore. And we've had a number of presentations about that in the city. And of course, the technological revolution, whether that's the shift from oil to renewables, or whether it's the impact of big data and what we are able to do with IT, focus primarily in cities. Yeah? So there are a lot of people who have made the case that development has to become more city-centric. But nobody's made it more than the Green constituency, the science researchers, and the lobbyists for an alternative way of being. And if you're not familiar with the idea of the urban acceleration, this is the idea that not only are we now living in an urban age, but that we are living in an urban age where change is happening at a compounding rate. This, in other words, is the window of opportunity to change everything about how our society is organized. And the details you can find in our recent paper in Nature there. And what that scientific argument has done has been to make the case that cities are key to policy. And you see that coming through on a number of different places in the global community. So even something like the IPCC on the left-hand side there, it's just a word cloud from the IPCC, starts off as effectively quite city blind. We've got a new meeting coming in Edmonton focused specifically on the question of climate change in cities as the city agenda becomes more and more central. The biodiversity report starts off on its very first assessment with a focus on cities. That culminates in the SDG 11, an explicit focus on cities. And right across the UN system, whether that happens to be from WHO, but we could look at almost any organization within the UN system, this recognition of what does it mean to look at children in cities? What does it mean to achieve any one of those SDGs? That integration question, which of course is across many of the different domains, but which gets concentrated in urban space. But what's really important is not just that there is a focus on cities. This is an important slide conceptually. And we want to think about what it means. What the Green Agenda and what science argued and what was taken up in that formative shift that Achim was putting forward for us was not just the idea that the environment should be added to the mix of sustainable development, pretty much as it was interpreted through Brundtland in the earlier phases, but that we should see cities not just as sites of intervention, economic, social, and environmental, urban and rural, yeah? That's good, but it's not enough. Not just that we should see cities as centers from which change takes place. In other words, the economy may be concentrated in a city, but it will diffuse out. Social change will be concentrated in a city, but it will diffuse out. But what is really significant about the argument that we find implicit in the 2030 Agenda is that cities are centers, they are transformative pathways of social and economic change. In other words, this is the stuff that will trigger the longer term, the wider implications, which will rupture those boundaries or enable us to stay within them. And it's on that basis of this argument about pathways, which doesn't negate a focus on the rural, but it does see the city as the epicenter, as the critical site that these arguments were made from science, picked up and incorporated into the SDG process. It was a fundamental realignment, if you like. And where we are at now is to move beyond what Achim was talking about, was to say, okay, so what does that mean in terms of the next steps for those of us in development studies, in any aspect of science? What kind of science do we require in order to put that view, that philosophy, that perspective, that cities are pathways of sustainable development change into practice? And it's within that context that there's the beginnings of a coming together to say we need to rethink and build an urban science, we need to rethink and build sustainable development thinking with the city as a central pathway. And that is complicated. Cities are messy, and we're going to have to look in much more nuanced, much more textured kinds of ways at what that kind of regulation, that kind of management of urban space implies. And critically, it will imply, we know that it will imply, a fundamental rethink of the systems of government and of governance that we have in place, and it will require a whole set of new ideas. Let's just talk about those two things, the governance arrangements and the ideas, and then I will try and pull them together. Now, the real difficulty that we face is, many of you will be aware, and I know we're talking to a community of many people who are directly involved, that the UN system itself is in the process of reconfiguration. Some of that, for an urbanist, centers on UN habitat, and yes, for those of you who recognize it, that is Nairobi at the headquarters, and this is a critical moment in that process. The issue of where do you locate the urban? Why is the urban located there? Who drives the urban agenda at the global scale? Who interacts with nation states on their urban agenda is really, really important. How do we set that agenda? Who takes the leadership for that? But it is not the only question that is up for discussion in the governance domain. That's If Mayors Ruled the World. I don't know if any of you have read that. It's a very provocative book, and in my view, a relatively simplistic idea. But it is this assertion, and in the context of American politics, quite easy to make the case that wouldn't it be nice if mayors ruled the world? But the point is that we have to find a way not just to talk to 177 nations, but to talk to the thousands, the tens of thousands of settlements through which the SDGs will be localized, through which we will achieve our alternative visions. And so this question of devolution is absolutely critical. I don't know if you recognize the map on the left. No? Anybody? It's not upside down. You just got to change your view. It's a map of traditional land in Africa. It's a very dated map, and the reason that it is so dated is because I cannot find a map of tribal authority and control in the African context. And I asked my colleague for India if she had it, and yes, there is one of scheduled castes, but not at the local level that we require here. And yet, the settlement decisions, the resource management decisions, the social negotiations that take place in the settlements that we have across the world almost always do not just include the global scale, the national scale, and the municipal scale, even though we would like it to have more at the local level. But it includes a whole domain of governance practice, which is not acknowledged, which doesn't appear. And so it seems to me that as we begin to look for alternative governance arrangements, communication, to deal with the complexity, these domains, and we perhaps should have had a corporate logo in there too, because of course it's many of the corporates and the banks who also make those very, very significant settlement decisions. And so the idea that I'm putting to you here, and that's the logo from one of our new projects, which is just trying to get to this question of how do we understand the complexity that cities present and at the same time deal honestly, not with a naive, as scholars have often done, vision of a transdisciplinary, collaborative, if we all sit and talk about it for long enough, we will agree. How do we deal with some of those incommensurabilities so that we can begin to prioritize, so that we make the right decisions to make the scaled interventions that are necessary to shift the urban pathway in this window of opportunity that we have, so that the urban acceleration doesn't become the moment of our cataclysmic decline, but rather is this moment where we were actually able to harness and realign where it is we're going from. And I think you're able to go through some of those lines of complexity, and you may add more to those. Operationally, there are going to be some critical hubs, and this for us as thought leaders, as this epistemic community that Achim talked about, become really important. And I would suggest to you that there are going to be at least 3 really critical points which, as knowledge brokers, we need to be able to engage. The first is the SDGs, and there has been a massive intellectual advance on that. There is much to come. The data that is being put in place at this point to monitor the indicators will set us on a path that will make the definition of GDP look like a minor point in a matrix of indicators that determine how we see the world. So we're in a very formative stage. But there are others, and for me, one of the most important in these is likely to be the national urban policies. Perhaps even more important than national development policies, which we've spoken a lot about at this conference. And there is no blueprint for what those are, and they will vary from place to place. But critically, what national urban policies do is they take cognizance of the fact that it's going to be the nation state that will report on progress. They acknowledge that what national governments do has implication in urban space, and ideally, they facilitate the process of devolution. They begin to allocate powers, functions, and resources to the scales at which the interventions will be really, really important. And ideally, they will be, of course, both process and outcome specific. I do, however, want to challenge us in this regard. National urban policies have got they're not new instruments. You can find them, they've been used historically in all sorts of kinds of ways. And I am a South African, if you hadn't got that from the accent and the university affiliation. And I want to remind you of the ugly history of a national urban policy. In other words, making interventions doesn't always assume a progressive end. They can be used in unintended ways and perhaps in intended ways for malicious purpose. And certainly in the 1970s, copying from global ideas about what spatial development should do, we see this push of urbanization into decentralization, not devolution, decentralization, pushing out an anti-urban sentiment, keep people out. Perhaps one can think about some of the migration dynamics in Europe in some of those kinds of ways. A very ugly history. Similarly, just because development thinkers and development economists, dare I look at one in the front row, discover space, does not mean they do so in a way that is useful and productive for understanding social and political process. And certainly the history of that is that we haven't done that very well. And so as we go into what I think will become a rush, a flurry of spatial development practices, of beginning to try and align and think about the new normative base that we have in spatial terms, in alternative governance terms, I do think we need to be able to understand what are going to be the triggers that are going to get us to an alternative low-carbon economy. What are going to be the triggers that are going to take us not to a big data automation run world which doesn't deliver the social compacts that we require? And I don't think that we've actually got there as yet. What is clear to me, and this is a book come out on the South African context, which is really provocative because the amount of time we have to achieve 2030 is about the same amount of time since the end of apartheid. Yeah? You want to know what can be done? In a fundamental realignment, and it's very clear that one of the things which is necessary is a capable state. Has all sorts of implications, but we cannot bypass the state in important kinds of ways. Excuse me. I want to suggest then that we are entering into, got a frog in my throat, bear with me. We are entering into new terrain. We've had a bold, transformative agenda. It really is bold. I want to underscore what we've heard this morning. We are into radically new territory. The ideas which exist in the academy, the places that we understand in the academy, our knowledge of the interactions of different dynamics across specializations are simply not up to the task of guiding policy in significant kinds of ways. What's more, even when we do have expertise, we don't know where to deliver it. And that is nowhere more obvious than in the case of cities. An awful lot of what we know has only very micro-level application. It is very specialist application, and we see fundamental contradictions not dealt with. What do we need for biodiversity are corridors which allow species to move through cities. What do we need from climate change? We want really dense cities. Well, how do you manage that in practice? And what and where do decisions get made? And so I think the research community is gearing up very actively to address some of these concerns. But what I should have put on here was the map, which many of you will have seen in the Times Higher Education Supplement a couple of months back, of the absolute distortion of where knowledge lies. It's a much better map of the global north and south than anything else that we've seen. And it is terrifying when we begin to start thinking about what that means in terms of where the urban challenge lies. And so, although we have a whole range of initiatives, some of them, the one down at the bottom in green, backed by the Swedes, thank you very much, a very significant program to massify and expand the research capacity in the African context to deal with urban change. We're nowhere near at where we need to be in developing that knowledge base. And so, in coming together and trying to conclude this argument that we need to focus on cities, not because cities are in and of themselves more important than anywhere else, but because it is in cities that these pathways, perhaps along with what was argued for the Green Revolution some decades back, but the urban transition is one that we have failed to understand in very significant kinds of ways. And what we absolutely need to be able to do is to see that urban future and to develop the science that is going to help us to inform those interventions. There is no question that that requires a very significant investment and realignment of who we understand to be the professions who will build the cities, manage the cities, design the cities, regulate them and enforce them, and be part of that intellectual leadership on the ground, in the CBOs, in the churches, in the mosques, in significant ways. A massive expansion of leadership in that regard. And then finally, the point that I've been making in a number of ways through this meeting, that we do need to reconfigure the governance arrangements in ways that not only expand the capacity at the local level, but do so in ways that connect in appropriate points to national interventions, to regional processes, and to global processes. And sadly, colleagues, I leave you with the idea that, in fact, we are not fit for purpose at the moment. And because of that, the continent from which I come from, and this is the last slide, which I believe will be the litmus test of whether or not we achieve these green pathways, is one that will suffer. So the yellow spaces are those which have a share of the population that is living in informal or slum conditions, whatever terminology you prefer, and you see how dominant that is. And so At the moment, the 2030 agenda only says leave no one behind, but I would suggest to you that we might want to think about it in slightly wider terms and have a more nuanced, layered understanding. Until such time as we can know we leave no species behind, we leave no person behind, no city behind, no nation, no region, it is our common future. And until such time as we recognize that some of those alternative pathways are ones that we fail to understand adequately and we fail to govern appropriately, we will not have acted responsibly and we will not be able to hold ourselves to account for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for this excellent presentation about why cities are important. And I think the 3 points were, but I'm making a caricature, of course. The cities are pathways of change. We need new multi-level institutions, and we really need a capable state. I would now like to invite both speakers to come up and to the podium, and all of you to participate in a question-answer session. And while you're thinking about what your first question is going to be, I have one question already from the audience for Professor Steiner.
Right.
Sorry.
He's looking after basic
We've got an
needs.
empty glass. It's real, not...
So the first question is, dear UNDP administrator, do you think that the SDGs are tackling the causes of the problems we face, or simply the consequences?
A bit of both would be my answer. But rather than either looking at causes or consequences, the way I interpret the goals is they define a set of positive objectives that are informed by bitter lessons of failure if you either ignore certain aspects in the development paradigm or if you overlook certain necessities, preconditions for success. So if you take the goals and you know, I don't want to recite them all back to you, I mean, whether it's no poverty or whether it is decent work and economic growth, whether it is, I was just looking for the urbanization, sustainable cities and communities. The way they are formulated, I mean, don't be distracted by the titles. This was one of those great moments in UN history when the intergovernmental process of formulating goals met the communications team to say, how do we translate your goals into something that people can understand? But if you go into the narrative behind each of these goals, they're actually defining a positive agenda that draws together a number of threads and you know, at its simplest is reproduced in the excellent presentation you just made. I mean, whether you take cities as pathways, as platforms, as accelerators for this kind of change, or you take the rural economy, which you said park for a moment, they are all trying to align effort, whether intellectual, institutional, governance, financial, technological, with let's say a common set of objectives against which we can judge success.
Susan, would cities be able to address the causes or the consequences? And when can they address the causes? Do they have the power?
Well, I think that they do have a lot more power than we register. And I mean, similarly, you know, they're both cause and consequence. But I mean, I think if you look at places where cities get on and build things and do things and people live regardless, the question is that what we want? And is that going to get us to where we need to be? And so the consequences may be things that you're exactly what you're wanting to shift. And if you're going to do that, you may need to give more power in order for them to be able to shift.
Are there questions in the audience? Yes?
Hello, thank you for two very interesting presentations. My name is Phil Mader, I'm from the IDS in Brighton. My question to both of you is, are there any measures we can take to ensure that the pathways towards sustainability that we globally pursue do not risk exacerbating, worsening the global inequalities that we seem to collectively tolerate? And I ask this particularly in light of the emphasis that I've heard on working with the financial sector and financial markets, rather than reversing the process of financialization, which I think many people here would agree has contributed to, if not created, the rather intolerable inequalities which we tolerate.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just on the financialization question, and I think one of the things that we have to be very careful of, and the advantage of the moment of collective responsibility, of a universal agenda, is that what it does enable us to do is to look at dynamics within the system and across the system. And one of the real dangers on the financial system as we have it at the moment, as you know, is that it is global in certain respects, but not in all. And it's extremely difficult to incentivize fiscal investment in places where we really require it. And so we'll end up rebuilding the shopping malls of Middle America. And so it's, yeah, for me it would be a case of saying, you know, can we put our finger on what some of the absolutely critical imperatives are to have a much wider, more global process, and where do we need local control? And local initiative and space, and not try and over-regulate absolutely everything. But to understand what the blocks in the system are, and to understand where there's been an incomplete superimposition of an apparently collective investment. So modernity would be the one thing for me, and there's no effective overlay between traditional modernity, and we pretend it doesn't matter, and yet we know that it does. Financialization is another. We throw our hands up in horror to talk about informality, but you will not get a bank to invest in somewhere where there is no regulatory process, where there's no certainty, et cetera, et cetera.
So moving on to an online question. It's in relation to untaxed wealth, and the question is addressed to you, Professor Steiner. If the vast untaxed wealth and profits in tax havens are not tackled, will not the development goals ultimately fail?
I'm not sure I can answer that in an authoritative way in terms of quantitative parameters, but I think it is no secret, and the work of the OECD and many others, including our international financial institutions, clearly have shown that there is an extraordinary amount of money that leaks out of an economy. And in the sense of tax evasion, clearly illegally so. So trying to tax, first of all, close loopholes, deal with also offshore tax havens, and essentially make people play their part as members of a society and a community is a no-brainer. I still think that, tackling that negative end of people trying to avert and avoid and escape responsibility is one part of the agenda. And if I can link it back for a moment to financialization, I think it's the incentivization that actually is the most significant tool that we have. There has been, and the environmental movement itself has been trapped for the past 30 years in the sense that economics and finance are by definition anathema to sustainability. And I think part of my work and that of many others that have worked on this, bringing the community of environmental science and change experts and researchers together with those who look at economics, financial markets, is perhaps one of the more liberating things, because we have also allowed ourselves to be imprisoned by the notion that a financial system, a particular economic model, is almost the equivalent of the laws of gravity, somehow rooted in the science. I mean, I am an economist by training. It's the most misguided, terminology to call economics a science. It's an interpretation. It's a search for models of choices, and it is a way of finding incentives to achieve social outcomes through economic instruments. And I don't have any problem with finance. Money is a means to an end, whether we trade in goats or in dollars or in gold or in diamonds. We have always had to find ways in which to be able to trade. And therefore, I think the real issue is, can we align the regulatory framework in such a way that the financial system that is there to take somebody's money, apply it to somewhere, achieve a return, whether as an entrepreneur, as a bank, as a hedge fund, whether that equation can also work in alignment with overarching objectives. And the SDGs are not a distraction, and the environmental or green economy agenda is also not something that by definition has to exacerbate inequality. The renewable energy story on the African continent is a classic illustration of that. From being almost the imposition of the wealthy because they polluted the world and now want Africa to not build coal-fired power stations, we today have African governments scrambling for renewable energy technology as a shortcut to access to energy. That's how quickly very deeply held convictions can change.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Where is the thank you? There, Joyeeta, in the left-hand corner.
Yeah, I gave it.
Now it's on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Henning Melber. I have a question to Achim Steiner. You ended kind of your presentation with the appeal that development studies should engage with UNDP. My question is, to what extent is UNDP willing and able to engage with development studies? And let me explain. The United Nations History Project has as a programmatic title to think ahead of the curve. And Agenda 2030 is not ahead of the curve, but it marks the curve. But at the same time, the current realities impose Agenda 2030 to a large extent on what is defined and funded as development studies. But does the UN system, and especially UNDP, not really need those who think beyond Agenda 2030, and that development studies could make a contribution to that? To which extent is UNDP able and willing to recognize that and maybe counteract the tendency that we are pushed into that straitjacket of Agenda 2030 and blue sky research, which has been so important all the times, and I know you have been among those who recognize that, is actually side-trapped. So we are falling by the wayside, despite the fact that the global contract of Agenda 2030 is entirely based on a voluntary principle. It's not binding.
Well, let me first of all acknowledge that I think you're asking a very legitimate question, and let me not singularize UNDP. I speak to you as somebody who has some influence over an institution, and in this case UNDP, and therefore I want to speak in the most direct possible way to you by saying, yes, it is my intention to help UNDP rediscover its role amongst those institutions that can be associated with thought leadership in development. And it has successfully done so in the past. It has attracted some of the most brilliant minds in the field of development studies. Amongst them Amartya Sen, just to mention one, who shaped one of the platforms on which we began to articulate through the UNDP, let's say, capacity to speak to the world, at least a counterpoint to how development was being defined, the UNDP Human Development Report. And we're having very intense discussions right now. Is the UNDP Human Development Report of 2016 still a product that provides thought leadership, or has it become a vehicle of regular reporting? I invite you to challenge the organization, as I'm challenging, in fact, my colleagues in UNDP, to start thinking about where is the frontier, the front line of research, and how do we re-engage with development thinking actors and institutions. I buy less into the notion of competition between Agenda 2030 related research and blue sky thinking. It's a little bit like when I listen to my colleagues in the international aid system who are constantly talking about the development and humanitarian nexus. I often cite this example. When I began my career over 30 years ago, one of the first things I was assigned to in an organization called GDZ was a working group on solving the development humanitarian nexus. And here we are still debating it. This is not a structural or not a conceptual challenge in trying to address priorities of research in Agenda 2030 and blue sky thinking. It's an allocational challenge. How much time, how much resources, how much attention do we give to things that are beyond 2030 that go or touch into the domain of the celestial in order to bring back ideas? And how much do we invest in the most promising platform upon which countries, yes, voluntarily, by consensus, and not by pretending that there is one authority in this world that can dictate to the majority of the rest how it is to develop, can actually move forward. And I see extraordinary opportunities. I gave you 3 or 4 areas in which I see them. The whole question of data disaggregation, to pick up on Susan's point of leaving no one behind. Many people put this phrase into the sort of prosaic. It is actually the most fundamental challenge to the Washington Consensus that has been articulated through an international agreement, which is precisely a challenge to the notion that development is all about trade-offs, who you can leave behind in order to sort them out later. The SDGs in Agenda 2030 is a frontal challenge to 25 years of trading off in the name of the majority of those that development was actually supposed to serve.
Wow, that's a... Yes, at the back. Oh, okay.
Oh, thank you. Financialization, incentivization, cities, capitalism. I have a good example. The mayor of Atlanta coined the term public purpose capitalism, and he rebuilt Atlanta. It's green, it's thriving economically, it's social. So capitalism can be a vehicle. There are other terms like Rachi Sodia's social capitalism, Bill Gates 2.0, but it's capitalism which is the vehicle. We cannot negate this. My question, can we?
No, it starts, this is where the capital accumulates.
There is a very interesting debate that goes on about the African city. Because some urban theorists argue that cities are the manifestation of capital accumulation. It's what defines cities, concentration and capital accumulation. There are other people who argue that, in fact, if you go and walk through the streets of Mogadishu, or you go and walk through the slums of any number of the cities that I had up on the map there, there's very little evidence of accumulation, and there are exceptionally large urban places. It's very difficult to understand Kinshasa solely on the basis of capital accumulation. And so I am fudging your question, but other than to say, for me, one of the really difficult things is that when we think about the city of the 21st century, one that is characterized by a lack of jobs, it's characterized by a lack of investment, it's quite often characterized by a lack of large-scale investment which we associate with capital accumulation, and it's associated with building without financial support. It's often associated with building without debt. I'm not entirely sure that we understand the relationship between these very large places where increasingly the majority of the world live and capitalism itself. And it's that kind of thinking, perhaps Henning, to go back to your point, where I do think that some very clear blue skies thinking is required, where we have a much, much clearer engagement between people who genuinely understand the financial system and between those who genuinely understand the lives of people that exist pretty much outside of those normal pathways that we would understand as being defined by capital.
Can I just add a thought here, because I think this is, it is either highly productive or highly distractive or destructive debate. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that political economy is a fundamental premise upon which you can conduct public discourse. And I often find myself in debates with people that, I should pay more respect to the political economy dimension of this discourse, because without it, you're missing the point, you're treating symptoms and not causes and so on. But let me just say to you, I think to some extent the terminology of capitalism, socialism, etc., Mother Nature, Mother Earth concepts can help us define our departure point. I think they rarely help us to describe the destination in practical terms. And the reason why I say this, if you take the development discourse over the last 30 years, we've gone from the extreme that the state is actually the solution to development to the almost complete opposite, where the market and the less state and the less government would be the shortcut to progress. Both have proven to be delusional, I think, in their singularity. And I think what we are finding is that development is a complex set of choices that need to be negotiated under certain conditions. The role of the state is to provide the regulatory framework in which markets can function. Markets are not well, how can I describe it? Autonomously functioning organisms. They are products of social choices, of laws, of traditions, of things that we accept. Slavery was a perfectly legitimate economic trade and market. And I was astonished to learn that even some Nordic countries were engaged in the slave trade, which I did not know until a couple of days ago. And yet today, this would be inconceivable in a Nordic social, ethical value system. So first of all, values can shift, economies can adjust. I think the important lesson we need to learn is that in the polarity, there is an analytical value, but often we have to find the much less clear terrain of bringing different things together. So in today's world, smart regulation, intelligent regulation, principled regulation, social protection floors, etc., provide us with tools to deal with markets. And the other example that we spent 10 years fighting one another over was privatization. When the bank began to roll out, the World Bank, the notion that water services, etc., should be privatized, there was an economic dysfunctionality driving this, but a fundamental flaw was that actually it was socially not acceptable to privatize a fundamental resource. So it was not so much the privatization of water that should happen, but you could easily argue and prove that the privatization of services related to water was a potentially positive and beneficial and economically rational policy option. A classic case where we spent 10 years in very deep polarized debates where the role of the market or the potential investor outside the role of the public purse went from one extreme to the other.
Thank you. I'm going back to an online question, which is in relation to big data. How can the UN access the massive database of Google and others to monitor the progress on the SDGs?
Well, we've already begun. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Google is just one example, and we have, numerous illustrations of that kind of data sharing capacity beginning to help us make smarter decisions, faster decisions, whether it's in the case of Haiti and the earthquake, where we learned very quickly to work with some of these data providers and communications companies, with satellite companies in emergencies, again, such as earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, but also through a partnership called Global Impulse, which is, very much premised on using data. But to be very honest with you, I think in the United Nations, we are, on a scale of 1 to 10 at about 0.2 in understanding the magnitude of the importance of data, gender disaggregated data, the ability to differentiate between vertical and horizontal inequality and how that may relate to ethnicity and to geography. This notion of leaving no one behind, interesting enough, one of the greatest priorities for governments that are now requesting UNDP, and there are over 114 as of last week who have invited UNDP to help them do what you alluded to, taking the goals to the national level, to the subnational level, to the municipality level, where actually some of the greatest interest seems to be emerging, is the ability to use data.
Yep.
Because part of the failure of government to make wiser choices is also related to the fact that you did not always know exactly where those left furthest behind, to use another phrase, are actually found. It's not always geography. And your map, by the way, was fascinating that you showed at the end of slum dwellers in African cities. I mean, urbanization is considered panacea, it's the breakthrough, it's the pathway, but actually in Africa right now, much of urbanization is also, a drama of failure unfolding before our very own eyes in terms of the number of people who live in conditions that simply are in no way superior to what the conditions were in the rural economy, but through just the singular opportunity to earn an income and therefore a living is reducing people to conditions of life that are just extraordinarily brutal.
There was a question at the back first, but I have only time for 2 questions, so please go ahead, and he should get the mic, please. He's been waiting.
There's one waving
There's one at
over
the
there.
back with the mic.
She was first.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Parnell. It's about service delivery. Education achievement is generally higher in cities, but cities like Shanghai, for example, exclude or discriminate against internal migrants. What can we do or should we do to address this injustice that maintains rural-urban inequality?
And before we take the answer, I want to give a chance to the gentleman in the back who's been waiting for a long time to ask his.
I'm Carlos Weiner from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. In the last 30, 40 years, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development are promising change the world with new agendas and new proposals and new models, and it failed. Why should we believe that this time it will be different? Since we have the same institution in charge, the same interests commanding the world, why should we believe that this agenda will change what in the last 40 years have become less the same?
Should I?
Please.
Thank you for the question about services. If I might answer it in a slightly wider context, not just of urban-rural migration, but perhaps to go back to a debate that was nascent in the conference, which was about migrants/refugees, and the question we had from my colleague, Kathy Sutherland, pointing out that in fact there are many, and you made exactly the same point, that there are 65 million people who move from place to place in an involuntary way. And the consequence of that is almost always that they have no access to services on their arrival point, whether that's in a refugee camp or in a city which has that. And I think one of the things which is going to be really critical, and Carlos perhaps this speaks to your point about why might we believe in the opportunities for change, is that I think unless we begin to take cognizance of the scale of that mobility and the scale of that exclusion of our current service delivery models, of our current nationality models which predetermine your access to services, we are putting ourselves at immense risk of massive social protest. We are putting ourselves at immense risk of massive health outbreaks. We are putting ourselves at risk of the real detriment of our own humanity. And I think it's potentially possible, particularly given things like new data, that you would be able to be admitted to hospital, that you might have access to free water in order to secure your basic needs. And it seems to me that that's precisely the challenge of the universal agenda. And I say this to our colleagues in Norway meaningfully. You know, what is the lowest possible level of subsistence in Oslo or Bergen? And how does that translate into Kinshasa or Harare? And until such time as that is the same level, we have not got to a universal agenda. And part of that is about whether you have access as a migrant to some of those basic services. So and then very, very briefly to Carlos, I mean, I think for me, your skepticism is completely right, and we should be holding organizations to account. And we should be continuing to do so. The thing for me which is really significant about what I would think of as a post-neoliberal framing of a developmental conundrum is that I think for the first time we are actually beginning to move into recognizing the returns on ecosystem services, the returns of the intergenerational investments of locations in particular places, and that the immediacies of profit have been removed from being so dominant in the framing of a lot of interventions. And if we can hold on to that collectively, and I think that a younger generation have got a very strong vested interest because our generation has so actively failed in that regard. And so it's them that I look to actually hold us and the organizations to account.
Yeah. Can I just add a couple of sentences? I think the goals are, in a sense, less prescriptive, if more systemically relevant than past, let's say, paradigm shifts in the sort of development institutions landscape. The Washington Consensus sort of and structure adjustment, being a particular extreme. But let us also recognize that, along the way, there have been many success stories, whether in primary education, in maternal health care, and child mortality, nutrition, life expectancy. I mean, the last decades are not only decades of failure. What I think the SDGs are, and it's my very simplistic way of finding an analogy that shows how old I am, but also how much I'm fascinated by the younger generation. It's like an operating system. It's designed by people who have learned a lot about what works, what doesn't work, and what is unlikely to work if you don't do a number of things in one go. The challenge for us today is not to be imprisoned by this operating system, but to use it as a platform. And to me, the analogy of the applications is immensely empowering. I mean, if I watch what I have downloaded as applications on this thing called iOS that I haven't got a clue how it works, who designed it, but it actually gives me access to things that really help me solve problems, then I think we are looking at the SDGs, what they're meant to be. Not somebody's development ideology, but in some ways, the basis upon which more intelligent development decision-making becomes possible for me, starting even with individuals. And that's where, in the context of a debate in UNDP right now about, what is our role as a development institution in the year 2017, one of our colleagues borrowed a financial system analogy, which I'm intrigued by, and I leave you with this not as in any way saying that is it, nor am I convinced of it, but it's an interesting concept that I think has to do with a lot of what we have tried to talk about today. We need more systemic approaches, we need to recognize risks, the risks of inaction, etc. Is the role of a development institution such as UNDP today to de-risk development? To lower the risk of making narrow development decisions, to place bets on singular agendas when we know that development is complex, it requires systemic responses. Leaving people behind for too long and too large a number is going to undermine the development process, just like the ecological vulnerability will ultimately self-destruct our economic foundations for progress. And I find that notion quite intriguing, because it's not to take development into the realm of banking, but to take a concept that is not irrelevant to what we are trying to do, namely to inform, help societies to make wiser, less riskier choices, more sustainable choices. Maybe that is part of the business of development, so to speak. Just a thought to sometimes lift us from one epistemic community to another and see if we can actually translate some of these concepts back into where the core of our work is. But again, privileged to be here with you, Susan, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for your excellent presentation. And Professor Steiner, you may become the object of our research. We'll be following your work with a lot of attention, but also we hope to become partners and to be able to contribute to your work through perhaps more multi-level governance approaches. I invite you all to join me in giving a hand to our speakers.
Thank you. I look forward to staying in touch.
Yes. Thank you so much. First of all, Achim Steiner, for your contribution. Thank you so much. Please accept our small gift.
Thank you.
Fear shall not triumph.
Excellent.
From the Rafto Foundation. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you so
Parnell.
much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Joyeeta, Gupta. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you please would just stay with me for 90 more seconds, then I will not attempt to wrap up the conference, but rather point to some observations or key points that deserves to be highlighted. I know that it is lunch, so I will be quick. First of all, the quality of the presentations. This is the wrap-up, the not wrap-up. The keynote presentations have been excellent. To be honest, I often get very bored and or disappointed at conferences when the keynote addresses does not deliver what they promise. I may be a little biased, but the keynotes have been spot on in addressing the four main themes of the conference: inequality, migration, tax justice, and the green shift and sustainability, as we saw in the last one. Secondly, the variety. 77 panels, several side events, hundreds of presentations, a diverse variety in the state of art of research on global issues. development research and practices. The conference is about new knowledge, pushing borders, but it's also about people, creating new networks, meeting and connecting to good people, meeting provocative people, disagree and agree. And we are honored that the head of UNDP prioritized to present a keynote at our conference. I believe that illustrates the relevance of our field, our conference, and all our contribution as a research community. The conference is the result of teamwork. First, teaming up with EADI. I know that we have complimented each other throughout the conference. Maybe it's a bit much, but honestly, it has been a very smooth and constructive cooperation. There will, of course, always be different views of how we should do it, what to focus on, and how we should prioritize. But the climate for finding optimal solution, and not only bleak compromises, has been excellent. Isa Bod, Jürgen Wiemann, Susanne von Itta, Julia Schöneberg, Thomas Hollekamp, and the entire team, including the EXCO committee leaders, thanks a lot. Secondly, teaming up with the University of Bergen and CMI. Bergen is a small city, and cooperation makes us better. From CMI, sincere thanks to Ottar Mestad, Arne Strand, Odd Helge Fjellstad, and Arne Vik. Thanks a lot. At the University of Bergen, several people have been involved. First, I would like to thank all the students and volunteers from University of Bergen and also the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. You've seen them in blue t-shirts, they have guided you around. Some of you are here, you can raise and we can clap. Thanks a lot. For input on plenaries and setup, great thanks to Ragnhild Overå, Peter Andersen, Susanne Bygnes, Synnøve Bendiksen, and Håvard Hårstad. And not the least to Doreen Ryland, who made sure to keep the budget in black rather than red figures. And Tord Røe, the man who keeps all the threads together. Thank you so much. This is very much your work in close cooperation with Julia and Susanne at EADI. Thanks a lot. At the end, let me also put this in an NFU and Nordic Development Conference context, briefly. Every second year, the Nordic Development Research Associations organize conferences. In 2011 in Copenhagen, then in Helsinki, 2015 in Gothenburg, and now here in Bergen. As it coincided with the triennial EADI General Conferences, we agreed to join forces. During this conference, the Nordic Network has decided to continue to organize biennial Nordic conferences. And we are looking forward to the 2019 conference somewhere in the Nordic countries. We are also looking forward to the next EADI conference in 3 years' time. It is not decided yet where. It will not be in Bergen, I'm fairly sure. On behalf of NFU, all the Nordic Development Associations and all the organizers, I will sincerely thank each and every participant for taking part, for presenting new knowledge, for pushing us forward. Enjoy lunch and enjoy the last session after lunch.